Good evening and welcome to the fifth presentation of Avalanche Canada's 2021 and 22 webinar series. My name is Brent Strand. I'm your producer for the evening. Alex Cooper is also online. He's going to be the moderator for this evening and looking out for your questions in that Q&A box. Thanks for joining us tonight. Looks like the winter has started off with a big bang there a few weeks ago. A lot of snow built up and then we had that big warming. You know, what are the conditions like now? Avalanche Canada's mission is to help you folks get educated and understand what you're up against in the backcountry. We want you to play safe in the mountains this winter, and we want you to know more, go farther, and come home. First, we'd like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted in the territory of four nations, the Sinixt, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, and the Silks. As a national organization, we also acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations whose lands we live and recreate on. I would like to thank our sponsors today. We have some government partners that help us out, being loyal with their financial support during these challenging and economic times. We have our main program partners. We have premier sponsors. We also have a whole bunch of contributors and folks that support us throughout the year. This webinar in particular is sponsored by the North Face. The North Face has been a sponsor for Avalanche Canada since its inception. We're very grateful for their ongoing support and commitment to avalanche safety. So a couple housekeeping notes, everyone. You're all muted when you come in today. You don't have access to your video cameras. If we want to ask a question, you can put your hand up. I see we have a Kathy Critchen over there. She's already played with the hands up button. We also ask if you have a question to type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat button. There's also a Q&A button. For those questions, we really ask that you use that Q&A box. It's really hard for us to track the questions in the chat box, so they may get missed. And then as well with the chat box, that's where all our resource links and web links and stuff like that are going to be populated into. So tonight's presentation, understanding avalanche problems. Like everyone probably knows, you know, what's the danger rating today? Is it considerable? Is it moderate? Is it high like it was last week, or even extreme sometimes? You know, pretty much everybody gets that first layer of information. But the second level is really understanding the avalanche forecast and how to handle avalanche problems. That's that second tab on your website when you're looking at that, or on your phone. You know, that's what our forecaster, Simon Horton, tonight, he's going to try and explain that and clarify it in tonight's webinar. Understanding avalanche problems is a key to your safety and enjoying the winter backcountry. So right off the bat, folks, I want to do a couple polls here. The first one, I just want to know, like, what kind of users are we got out here? Are you a skier? Are you a snowboarder? You know, ice climber? Do you do multiple activities out there? Like, what are you up to out there? So we'll like get you folks to just click on what you're happening. It looks like we got a lot of skiers, boarders out there, pretty heavy percentage rate. You know, got some people doing multiple stuff, some sledders, snow bikers, some snowshoers and hikers, and then it looks like we got one ice climber hanging out with us here. So let you folks see the results there. You know, 60% of us are skier, boarder, and then we got 5% sledders, and then some snowshoers and hikers, and then some multi-use folks there with that singular ice climber out there. And then the other thing that we're kind of curious about is what level of training do you have? Like, have you taken any training? Is it just little seminars like this? Do you got an AST1? Or do you got any pro training? Maybe that CA level 1, or maybe you're from the US. You got a little bit of training down there at ARI and stuff. So let us know what you got going on. You know, looks like we got a bunch of folks showing up with an AST1 here. Yeah, pretty good. Looks like we got at least half of you folks have got an AST1. That's great to see. And AST2 at 20%. You know, that's pretty good stuff to see. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Simon Horton, and he's going to talk about those various avalanche problems. And yeah, I'll let Simon take it away.
Thanks, Brent. Just going to take a second to share my screen here. And do you see that? Hello, Brent.
Yeah, you look good, Simon. Sorry.
Oh, thanks. Okay, hey everyone, I'm Simon. I'm an avalanche forecaster with Avalanche Canada. And I'm excited to talk to you about avalanche problems. It's really a central part of what we do as forecasters. We're thinking about all these avalanche conditions, but trying to distill it down to some simple information that we can provide for you to help you plan a safe day in the backcountry. And as Brent said, often the first thing you see is a danger rating, but what's under the hood of that is a ton of details. We're thinking about weather, the snowpack, avalanche activity, as well as how people are moving through avalanche terrain. It's a lot of complex things, and condensing it down just to a single danger rating is quite a simplification. And avalanche problems are a really great link from the danger to the actual specific details about what's going on in the mountains. A good analogy would be like the check engine light in the car. When that comes on, you know there's something going on, but it can be kind of frustrating because you don't actually know what to do about it. Whereas if you get an actual indicator light that tells you it's a battery or brakes, it helps you really kind of problem solve and make a better plan. So the goal of this webinar is to first describe the 8 types of avalanche problems that we use in our forecasts. And then on top of that, I want to give you some tips on how you can incorporate them into your daily process, as they can be really good tools to both help you plan your trip and when you're actually out in the field trying to make decisions about terrain. As I talk about the avalanche problems, a lot of this information is also available in other places. It's definitely part of the avalanche skills training program, where they cover avalanche problems there, as well as in the handbook. We have the AvSavvy tutorial on our website. There's a number of videos that have great illustrations of avalanche problems. And finally, the glossary is where we have definitions for some of the more technical terms, like the different types of avalanches and problems. I believe Alex can put some links to some of these resources in the chat box, but all of it you can find by going to avalanche.ca and clicking on the Learn tab at the top. So we really like to reinforce the daily process. It was introduced into the avalanche training curriculum a few years ago, and it's a really nice structure to give you a systematic way of planning, going out in the backcountry, and at the end of the day, reflecting in a way that helps you make safe terrain decisions and also learn from your decisions so that over the course of your career and life, you can get better at making backcountry decisions. Avalanche problems definitely come in after you read the forecast and you want to start thinking about planning possible trips that day. And they're also useful in the field. With that first step of getting the forecast, you often see the danger rating to start. And typically we get a rating for each vegetation band. The danger rating uses the 5-point scale, which is defined based on the size, likelihood, and distribution of avalanches. And based on that, there's also some generic travel advice. For the higher end of the scale, like high and extreme danger, the travel advice is pretty simple. We recommend people to avoid avalanche terrain altogether on those days. At the low end of the scale, it's relatively simple. There's generally safe conditions, meaning that in most terrain, practicing good travel habits will keep you safe. And then there's this middle zone, and I'm sure anyone who's gone into the backcountry can relate to these are more difficult situations. And they're really the most common situations we have on most days of the winter. And when you're operating at this level of danger, the travel advice has things like cautious route finding or identify features of concern. And this can be kind of difficult to know exactly what that means. It means that some terrain is safe and some terrain isn't safe. And I think this is really where avalanche problems can help you by having a better understanding of what safe and unsafe terrain could look like. So the next step of the daily process is planning your trip after reading the forecast. And there's some decent things you can do without actually going into the danger or without going into the avalanche problems. And that's if you use the avalanche terrain rating system, simple, challenging, and complex. You can use the evaluator trip planning tool, where you can look up the type of terrain you're thinking about heading into and the danger rating for that day, and get a general sense of whether or not travel is recommended in that type of terrain for those conditions. On our website, we have a trip planning tool where for a lot of popular areas, the different types of avalanche terrain have been mapped out. And you can click on a specific zone and get a real-time pop-up chart that shows you where conditions fall that day. So while this is a helpful tool, it's limited in that not all areas have this mapping, and that it doesn't give you a ton of details within that terrain, what type of slopes could be safe or unsafe. And as I alluded to, that's where avalanche problems help. This is something that actually started from the heli-ski community about 20 years ago. And really experienced guides were noticing that their terrain decisions weren't often depending on the danger rating, but more so on the character of avalanches they were expecting. They started to identify that where they went really depended on the types of avalanches they were concerned about. And it became such a useful way of planning trips into the mountains that it quickly spread through the avalanche forecasting community. And it's been in the public forecast for almost 15 years now. The modern definition of an avalanche problem is a set of factors that describe the avalanche hazard. But it's simpler to think of it as a common scenario. There's really only a handful of scenarios that you'll find in the mountains when it comes to avalanche problems. And for each scenario, there's a really handy set of tools about how to best manage the terrain for that scenario. And it's this part of the avalanche problem that makes it really helpful. Not so much the technical details of what layers exist in the snow, but more so the idea of how you want to manage your terrain when you're traveling in the backcountry. So I mentioned there's 8 types of avalanche problems in our forecasts. But before doing that, there's a simpler terminology that I don't want to confuse, and that's the basic types of avalanches. There's slab avalanches, which involve a weak layer of snow failing and a whole slab of snow falling down the slope. There's loose snow avalanches, which start at a single point in the surface and spread out as they move down. And Cornisavalence, which are when chunks of overhanging snow break and fall down. When it comes to avalanche problems, these common scenarios, we break it down into more categories. We have 5 types of slab avalanches, 2 types of loose avalanches, and cornices. And these first 4 types of slab avalanche problems, storm, wind, persistent, and deep persistent, are really the ones I want to emphasize tonight. Because for one, they're the most common types of problems we have. And also they're the most common ones involved in accidents. They're quite dangerous, potentially. So we're going to go through all 8 of these with a bit of extra focus on those first 4 and describe what these scenarios look like. Storm slabs are relatively simple in that they're involving layers of fresh snow. They become particularly common if we see about 30 centimeters of new snow. If you get 30 centimeters over a short period of roughly 24 hours, we start to see natural avalanche activity. And typically, if we get that amount of snow over 48 hours, human-triggered avalanches become quite likely. And overall, with storm slab scenarios, both the size and likelihood of the avalanches gets bigger the more it snows, which means the more it snows, the more dangerous it is. Sorry. In terms of terrain, storm slabs will happen on any steep slope where new snow is accumulating, especially when the slope angle is greater than 35 degrees. They're often worse higher up in open wind affected areas because the wind causes even more snow to get deposited on a slope. And they're common to trigger from convexities. We have a video here of someone sledding over convexity and triggering a storm slab avalanche. Thankfully, they were able to kind of stay under control and not get caught and carried too far in this avalanche. But a few things to point out in this video are: one, where they triggered it, just at the top of the convexity. And two, that you can see the snow is quite deep and fresh. And there's been quite a bit of recent snow. So that's a good example of storm slab conditions. So when it comes to how you want to manage this scenario, it's largely about avoiding steeper slopes that have lots of new snow on it. Also considering large avalanche paths, because there's potential for natural avalanches running down them when there's big storms. But one thing about this scenario is that it's relatively easy to get clues from your environment by paying attention to how much it's snowing and looking for signs of instability like cracking around your feet as you're moving through the snow. The next scenario is wind slabs. This is the most common avalanche problem because it's quite often windy up high in the mountains. And wind slab problems are formed by layers of blowing snow getting deposited on slopes. And these wind slabs are typically reactive for quite long periods of time after the wind event, often several days or even weeks. Whereas storm slabs typically heal within a matter of days, wind slabs can last a fair bit longer. You can often identify areas with wind slabs by looking at the texture of the snow. In this photo on the bottom left, we can see the rippley texture. In this photo on the top, we can see these kind of rounded pillows. These are signs that there's been wind-blown snow in these areas and there's high potential for wind slabs. The terrain is generally more narrow and less widespread than storm slabs because it's really only going to be a problem on the downwind side of terrain where wind has blown. This might change based on the wind direction and wind speed, but generally by avoiding terrain that's been wind affected and wind blown, you're going to be able to avoid wind slab problems. And so a very good practice with wind slabs is to stay high on ridges and avoid crossing steeper parts of slopes that have been wind affected. Problem number 3, persistent slabs. Now we're getting into trickier problems because unlike wind slabs and storm slabs, where there's a lot of obvious clues that there's conditions for those problems, persistent slabs can be a bit harder to detect. And with that, we often see quite a few accidents with persistent slabs. One of the main defining characteristics for these problems is that there's some kind of buried weak layer in the snowpack. Here's a video of some testing in a snow pit where they're identifying these weak layers as being poorly bonded. With persistent slabs, there's usually 2 main types of weak layers we're concerned about. There's surface hoar, which is a type of frost, and soft, sugary, faceted snow. We often see these layers with crusts nearby, which can also make them worse. Typically, when these layers are buried between 30 and 100 centimeters deep is when they're most concerning for human triggering and when we'll likely have persistent slab problems in the forecast. One characteristic of persistent slabs is that these layers can propagate really widely to make wide, large avalanches. This is a really impressive photo of an avalanche that's spread around all different aspects on this slope, and that's due to a very weak persistent layer. Another feature of this weak snow is that you can trigger avalanches remotely. In this video, the snowmobile is traveling through some lower angle terrain, but they trigger an avalanche on a nearby steeper slope because of that buried weak layer. And so with persistent slabs, there's also concern about traveling below steep slopes because of this property. When it comes to identifying terrain for persistent slabs, it really depends on where the weak layer forms. Some weak layers might be more likely forming in open trees, while others could be on sun-exposed slopes. So it's really helpful to read the forecast where we try to narrow down where these persistent slab problems are most likely. In general, it's worth noting persistent slabs can be more common in sheltered terrain or trees, places that you might typically think are safe from bigger storm and wind slabs. A key thing with managing persistent slabs is staying to slower steep angles. Below 30 degrees is generally safe, but being extra cautious around convexities and when you're beneath steep slopes. And a really key idea with persistent slabs is diligence and patience. It can take several weeks for these problems to go away. And during those weeks, it just takes patience not to be tempted to go into steeper terrain, because persistent slabs can cause large avalanches. And then there's deep persistent slabs, which have some similar characteristics, but I'll highlight a few of the unique things here. First, they typically involve a different type of weak layer, and that's depth hoar, weak snow at the bottom of the snowpack. This is particularly common in the Rockies and other cold, dry environments. And when we get avalanches on these deep layers, they tend to be quite large. And due to the nature of this type of weakness, they don't go away as quickly as a persistent slab typically does. They can last all season long and go through periods of several weeks without really producing avalanches, only to reemerge as a problem and produce large avalanches. The most common terrain to find deep persistent slabs is in big open slopes, and it's most common to trigger them in shallow areas where there's buried rocks. If you can kind of see in the background photo here, this avalanche was triggered where these thinly, shallowly buried rocks were underneath. Probably this concept that I associate most with a deep persistent slab problem is the idea of low probability, high consequence. That means that most of the time, you're not going to be very likely to trigger one of these avalanches, but the consequence of doing them are very high because these layers are deeply buried in the snow. So similarly, you want to be very conservative with your terrain selection, avoid big avalanche paths, and just be diligent and patient, because sometimes, some years in some regions, with a bad deep persistent slab problem, you just have to be really limited in where you can travel safely. So those were the big 4 avalanche problems I really wanted to emphasize. And I have a couple of exercises that it's going to use the poll feature here. And it's in this case, we're going to look at these 4 photos that show different examples of conditions in the mountains. And I want you to use the poll to say which of these photos does a wind slab problem seem most likely. Brent, can you pull up the polls?
Simon, sorry, you'll have to move that quiz box off your screen to somewhere
Oh.
else or minimize it. It's just
Yeah,
giving
thanks.
us a black square. Yeah.
Okay. Brent, did you just close the poll there?
Yeah, I did. And it popped that box up again on you. My apologies there.
It's okay. So yeah, out of these photos, photo C seems like the most likely situation for a wind slab problem. And there's kind of 2 main things that really catch my attention. One is that on these peaks, you see these plumes of snow that's being blown. That means there's likely wind slabs forming right when this photo is taken on these slopes beneath them. As well, in the foreground, we can see this ripply texture that suggests that there's been wind effect across there in the previous days as well. So in this case, I'd be quite suspect of any of the steeper slopes on this side of the ridge where there's been wind effect. The next quiz will be the same photos. Oh, sorry, wrong order, but with a storm slab problem. In which photo does a storm slab problem seem most likely? Okay, it looks like we have a fair number of answers in. And yeah, my thoughts on this one are that in photo D, we can see that it's snowing really hard. And it's kind of like an interesting or trickier one because we're not actually looking at avalanche terrain there. But this is pretty common of what kind of conditions you might see on a day with the storm slab problem. You might be traveling through the valley bottom and just be in really deep snow and see it snowing hard. And there's often not good visibility, so you might not be able to really see above you and up in avalanche terrain. But this is definitely the kind of conditions where I'd watch for storm slab problems. And actually, I remember I took that photo about 2 years ago in Kokanee Glacier Park near Nelson. And I remember traveling up and in through those trees, it suddenly got deeper and deeper, and there was cracking going on around our skis. And it was pretty obvious signs that it was snowing harder than we expected. And we had to reroute our trip and come back down through the trees instead of going down a more open, steep slope, which was our initial plan. So there's just an example of a storm slab problem. Before moving on to the other avalanche problems, I'm wondering, Alex, I'd be happy to stop and answer any questions if there's been any up to this point.
Okay, so I mean, I don't see any questions yet that haven't been answered, but yeah, if anybody has one, maybe we can just take one quickly if it comes in. Otherwise, we'll just keep moving on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I do have a plan on having time at the end to answer questions, but in case something comes up, feel free to put one in and I'll try to pause and answer it.
Yeah, I think a good question just came in from Ian, but I think it's a good one to answer towards the end, so we'll hold that for later.
Okay, thanks. So for these other 4 avalanche problem types, although they're not as common in the forecasts, there's definitely times where we use them, and they are really important to planning a safe day in the backcountry. So first we'll look at wet slab avalanches. These are characterized by when the upper snowpack reaches 0 degrees and becomes wet, and it runs down to some kind of weak layer or the ground and produces large wet avalanches. And these avalanches are really dense and heavy, often slower moving than dry snow avalanches. And this photo in the top right corner really kind of shows some of that destructive potential. It looks like gross mashed potatoes that are ripping out trees. But thankfully, we can generally avoid these by not traveling out in avalanche terrain on really warm days when it's intense sun or heavy rain. This is the kind of time when we expect wet slab problems, especially in the spring. Loose wet problems are similar, but typically not quite as big and destructive because we're typically now only looking at the uppermost layers of snow that have gotten wet. And as a loose avalanche, they typically start at one location and spread out. A few years ago, one of our field teams in the South Rockies took this really good video of just walking along near a ridge, starting a small loose wet avalanche by their skis, and then watching it get bigger as it spread down. We can see it wasn't very big to start with, or not very fast. But as it moves down, it just gets more massive and to the point where you definitely really wouldn't want to be caught in that, as it would push you into trees or possibly into some type of terrain trap. So loose wet avalanches are most common on steep sun-exposed slopes. And we can see them in more than just the spring, but on warmer days throughout the winter as well. So in terms of managing these, if you see a loose wet avalanche problem in the forecast, you want to think about planning routes that are going to avoid slopes that are getting hit by the sun. And potentially, if that's not an option, to finish the day early so that you're out of all of the avalanche terrain before things really heat up. Loose dry avalanches. In general, loose dry avalanches aren't as big as other types, and it's usually just loose, dry powder snow falling down really steep terrain. You've probably all seen them lots in ski movies, as they're common when people are riding a big Alaskan spine. So quite often the biggest hazard with loose dry avalanches is either getting pushed over a cliff if you're in very steep terrain, or getting buried in little gullies or terrain traps where the loose snow can pile up to be quite a bit deeper. They're most common during storms when there's been a lot of low density snow. And sometimes we also see them when it's very cold without new snow, but just the surface snow loses some strength and cohesion from the cold temperatures. It's also a relatively common type of avalanche problem that mountaineers and ice climbers need to think of as they travel into really steep terrain. It might not be common to see slab avalanches in that type of terrain, but loose dry avalanches can have very big consequence when you're in steep, precarious spots. And then we have Cornisavalence problems as our last type. So cornices are a feature that are often present throughout the winter, and they form when windy conditions pick up loose snow and form overhanging bits of snow. And they're always something you want to be careful with in the mountains. But when we add it as an avalanche problem in the forecast, that means we have really heightened concern about them collapsing. Usually that's because it's really stormy and it's going to be more snow or wind, making them bigger and more weak. Or warm temperatures can also make them more prone to collapse. Some of the threats they pose are that if you're traveling below, they're very heavy, dense masses of snow, and you don't want to be hit by one. Sometimes, if within combination with another type of avalanche problem, this can be a trigger for an avalanche on the slope below. And they can also be dangerous just for people traveling along ridges. In this video, the snowboarders approaching a slope, and they get a little too close to the edge, and a big chunk falls off a cliff on the backside. So you want to be really cautious when you're approaching a ridge and you can't see over the other side, because getting close as you move towards the edge of the cornice, there's a risk of it breaking off. So those are the descriptions of the 8 types of avalanche problems we have in the forecast. And I thought I would kind of summarize them by giving kind of one key thought with each one of them, something that I'm really thinking about when I write a forecast and that I want people heading into the backcountry to think about based on that problem. With storm slabs, I'm really concerned about steep slopes with fresh snow on it. With wind slabs, it's all about paying attention to wind loading and identifying areas where there's been wind loaded snow. With persistent slabs, the main idea is conservative terrain, avoiding steeper slopes where the weak layer and slab combination might exist, and practicing patience because of this structure. Deep persistent slabs are similar, except being even more conservative because of the high consequence of triggering a deep slab avalanche. With wet slabs, it's really about avoiding slopes that are warming up significantly. And similarly with loose wet, although generally it's more caution rather than avoid, because they won't likely be as big as a wet slab. With loose dry avalanches, you'll be thinking about caution around terrain traps, especially when you're in steep terrain. And with cornices, it's about taking caution when you're on and below ridges. And this kind of sums up a lot of all these complex layers and weather patterns into a few kind of key practices to think about when you read an avalanche problem and are planning a trip. So I have a few more of these photo exercises. And these ones, we're going to look at this one big photo with a whole bunch of terrain in it. And I'm going to highlight an area and ask what avalanche problem would be most likely in this type of terrain. We'll start with this kind of open alpine bowl in the top right corner. What type of problem would be most likely? Wind slab, persistent slab, wet slab, cornice, or loose dry? Cool. I've seen a lot of answers come in, and there's a pretty equal split with wind slab and persistent slab being the most popular answers. And I would say that's definitely an avalanche start zone. And there's potential for a lot of different types of avalanches there. I would say if we're talking about what would be most likely, it would be probably a wind slab, because being near a ridgetop, it's likely consistently getting wind loaded and likely throughout a lot of days in the winter would be holding a wind slab problem. Now, as for the persistent slab answer, it's certainly a terrain feature that I would be concerned about if there was a persistent slab problem, but it might not necessarily be in that terrain as frequently as a wind slab. The next little piece of terrain I want to think about are these steep openings in the trees, kind of down in the lower elevations. You can go ahead and put an answer in the poll. Okay, I've seen a lot of answers come in now. Brent, yeah, you've shared them now. I'm seeing persistent slab as the most popular answer and wet slab as common as well. Yeah, I'm happy that a lot of people saw persistent slab potential in that terrain. As I mentioned earlier, persistent slabs can be more common in more sheltered open trees than other types of problems. And you'd be less likely to get wind effect or cornices in that type of terrain. But if there was a persistent slab problem identified, especially around tree line, that would be the kind of slope I'd be quite concerned about. As for the wet slab, I can definitely see on a warmer day, especially towards the spring, it looks like a lot of that terrain is getting hit by the sun. And there likely is potential late in the season for wet slab avalanches there. But for the majority of the time in the winter, that would fit more into the type of terrain to watch for persistent slabs. Okay. The final one is going to be this really steep alpine section near this peak in the top. Okay, Brent, have you closed that poll? Can people see the responses now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we've had most of the answers come in with cornice and dry loose. And I would agree that kind of terrain has potential for both. I think in this specific instance, we don't see, there might be some small cornices in there, but they aren't significantly large. I was thinking more towards loose dry being really likely on those steep slopes that seem to be holding some snow. But I would certainly, if there was a cornice problem, I would be quite cautious under a big prominent steep ridge line like that as well. Before I move on, I think that's kind of this photo is a really good illustration of a variety of types of avalanche terrain. I'm wondering if there's any questions at this point about any of these quiz questions.
Hey, Simon, Alex here. We do have a few questions that have come in. The first one we got came in a bit earlier, and it was from Ian Poole. We just want to know what you think are the most overlooked avalanche problems.
Overlooked. I would say two that are particularly challenging would be the persistent slabs, because it's hard to see evidence sometimes when you're traveling around that weak layer exists. And also wind slabs can be tricky. Not always, sometimes they're just really in the obvious spots you'd expect them along ridges, but wind can do some funky patterns in the mountains. And I've definitely seen people getting surprised and surprised with wind slabs appearing in spots you might not expect them.
Okay. And coming from Clement, he was just asking about what about when wind slabs are buried? What should you still be concerned about them being buried deeper down?
There can be a problem. Generally, as any kind of weakness gets deeper, it becomes less likely to trigger. But yeah, sometimes we think of wind slabs as kind of a software wind slab that's fresh and an old hard wind slab. And hard wind slabs, which are particularly common like in spots like the Rockies, but any kind of alpine terrain, do have potential to trigger, and they're a bit trickier. You're kind of getting into more of this idea that I talked about with deep persistent slabs. It's more of a low likelihood, high consequence. And in this case, it's not a very deep weakness, but there's potential, because it's hard, that if you were to trigger it, it would spread widely and you could have a potentially large avalanche. So there's kind of a trade-off of, as things get deeper, they eventually will get settled and strengthened. But in some situations, and it can be sometimes hard to identify, old wind slabs can remain a problem.
Okay. And I'll do one more question here, which comes from Luis, and he wants to know, this kind of relates to storm slab problems, but is it best to avoid ski touring in big storms?
Well, yeah, it's definitely a storm slab type question. It's all about where you pick your terrain. Quite a lot of the more simple avalanche terrain, which is lower angle and away from avalanche paths overhead, can be safe during big storms, but you want to make sure you plan a route that's going to avoid the steeper avalanche terrain. I guess there are exceptional cases with very big storms where it probably wouldn't be pleasant to head out anyways.
Yeah. And just want to note, a couple people have asked about the best route up through this terrain, and I just want to point out that there's this photo actually is included in Avi Savvy as one of our route finding exercises. So I will go find a link to that and share it in the chat box for the people who are kind of wondering about that here. Yeah,
thanks. I think that'd be a great way to work with that, because yeah, this is really one of my favorite terrain photos that highlights a lot of different types of terrain. So I'm glad there's an exercise with it.
Yeah, great. There's some other questions, but I think maybe we'll save them a bit later on. Let you keep going here.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So up to this point, I've talked about the types of avalanche problems and kind of what they mean. But in the avalanche forecast, we give some specific details about them. We give information about where it's located in the terrain, based at what type of elevations and slope aspects. We estimate the likelihood that an avalanche of this type will occur, and give it a range of sizes of how big the avalanche would be for this problem. I'd also recommend people read the little text description below, because that's where the forecaster can really give some more specifics about the problem. Sometimes there might be details about the time of day, a specific part of a forecast region, or some kind of key threshold or detail that's really helpful for identifying the problem. And in a lot of cases, you might see multiple problems in the forecast. And when that happens, it's helpful to know that we order them in terms of overall importance. So problem number one will be the one that we think is the biggest contributor to the avalanche danger. But the fact that there are multiple in there does typically mean the situation is more complex. You have to think about multiple types of conditions when planning a safe route. And a nice bit of advice I'd give when that seems to be getting overwhelming or too complex is if you go back to the first page of the forecast, and underneath the danger ratings, there's the travel and terrain advice. In this section, we really try to distill all the key things from the avalanche problems into just a handful of ideas about how to apply it and do terrain choices. And I have a final quiz here that has a forecast. It's actually from last weekend in the Yukon with some danger ratings and travel advice. And I want you to make a guess based on these 3 bits of travel advice, what avalanche problems was the forecaster concerned about? I'll give you a minute to read through those options. Brent, we can give them a bit more time. This one's a bit more reading intensive.
Yeah, for sure. We're getting around 60% of the people coming up here. So yeah, people are getting it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it looks like answers might be slowing down now. Do you want to close it?
Yeah, results are on the screen for everyone there, Simon.
Okay, thanks. And it looks like the most common response was wind slab and deep persistent slab. And that was the case in this forecast. A lot of the advice there really seems to be like their main concern is a deep persistent slab. The first little bit about triggering wind slabs kind of hints that there are likely wind slabs on this day, but they're really concerned about them actually being a trigger for even bigger avalanches on the deep, some kind of deeper layer. And in that next bit of travel advice, it says these deep layers are more likely a concern in thin areas like rock outcroppings. And that kind of speaks to that deep persistent slab character, where it's quite often common to trigger them in areas that are shallow and rocky. The final bit is kind of just a good piece of travel advice on any day. Back off if you encounter whooping hollow sounds or shooting cracks. And I would say that applies equally well to both of the avalanche problems they're concerned about that day. So now we're going to take those same 2 avalanche problems, the wind slab and deep persistent slab, and apply it to this piece of terrain. And I've kind of identified 3 different zones in the photo. And I want you to answer which of these 3 zones would be the best place to avoid those problems. Looks like we're around 75% answered.
Yeah, They're shared now, Simon.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, in this case, I would think area 3 would be the best spot to avoid these problems. Some things that stand out to me in this photo is in the area number 1. It seems like it's pretty thin and we see rocks sticking out. It also looks relatively steep. And so with the deep persistent slab problem, that's the type of terrain I'd really want to be cautious about and likely avoid altogether. Over towards area number 2, it doesn't look quite as thin as area 1, but we see some rounded, more pillowy features that look like there's been a bit more wind effect, and perhaps maybe a bit of a cornice above along that ridge line, suggesting that wind's been blowing in that area. So I'd be worried about wind slab problems there. Deep lower down in area number 3, it seems like we could generally avoid kind of the big open rocky slopes where the deep slab problem is, as well as the more wind affected terrain. I guess one thing I will highlight is that with deep persistent slabs, there's also this concern of triggering on slopes below. And it's kind of hard to see in this photo whether or not this is directly downhill of this bigger terrain above you. So that would one thing I'd want to caution, especially on if the danger was hot, more elevated. There'd be concern that just because you're in these trees, open trees, I'd want to make sure that terrain wasn't connected to some steeper, more alpine terrain above where a deep persistent slab could release. All right, I'm going to take it back to this daily process I talked about at the beginning and give some hints about how I see avalanche problems can really enhance this and add more to your planning and travel. So we've talked about reading the forecast and going past the danger rating into the avalanche problem section. And if you do that, you can go into a bit more detail about your trip plan. You could start thinking about, based on the avalanche problems, what type of terrain do you want to avoid or be extra cautious about? You could also think about whether the problem can be avoided altogether with timing. This is often the case in springtime or when we're dealing with wet loose and wet slab avalanches. Also, it might give you an idea about what kind of conditions you want to pay attention to. A lot of these problems have some key indicators like wind for a wind slab problem or storm for a storm slab problem. And you might want to kind of have some ideas about, once you head out, if you see these kind of conditions, whether you want to have a alternate route, kind of a second option on your trip plan based on what you find in the avalanche problems. Once you get out into the field, the first step in our daily process is verifying conditions. And most of the time, this simply means checking whether the amount of snow that you're seeing locally agrees with the forecast. And this is important because, for one, our forecast regions are really big and the amount of snow we get can be quite variable. And secondly, forecasts are typically published the night before or the afternoon before. And there's often a bit of uncertainty about how much snow there will be overnight. So verifying conditions is a good thing you can do right off the bat. And with a better understanding of avalanche problems, you can sometimes verify more than just the new snow, but think about temperatures, the weather as a whole, and how they could be impacting the avalanche problems in the forecast. Then finally, for evaluating slopes. In the AST curriculum, we have a really helpful tool with the evaluator where you can look up avalanche conditions and terrain characteristics with checklists, add them up, and look up whether or not a specific slope seems appropriate for those conditions. But if you start looking at what's actually in the avalanche conditions, there's really strong links to the problems. One of the criteria is there a persistent or deep persistent problem in the snowpack? Another one, has there been heavy loading from new snow or wind? This is really speaking to the likelihood of a storm or wind slab problem being present. And critical warming. Has there been a rapid rise in temperature to 0 degrees? If so, this is a good condition for wet slab and loose avalanches. So if you're applying kind of the ideas of avalanche problems and planning your day around avoiding the avalanche problems, you're naturally going to be avoiding a lot of the more dangerous terrain and operating in the safer spot zone for slope selection. So these are how the avalanche problems can fit into the daily process. And I often like to wrap up any talk about avalanche safety with this little phrase, which is what you actually read on the bottom of those cards that have the avalanche danger on them. And it's you control your own risk by choosing where, when, and how you travel. And avalanche problems really capture the essence of where and when, because they really describe the nature of the avalanche hazard. And so I hope by understanding the avalanche problems, it can help you better control and reduce your risk when you travel in the backcountry. With that, I'd be happy to discuss and answer any questions that are out there.
Hey, Simon, thanks so much for that great presentation. We definitely have a few questions that have come in, and I'm sure we might get some more now that you've opened things up. Yeah, for the first question comes from Austin Hager. Sorry, Austin, if I mispronounced your name. And he wants to know, are we going to expect deep persistent slab problems from this rain crust that's widespread all over, Western Canada?
That's a good question. And at this point, it's kind of hard to answer still. It's going to really depend on how weather plays out in the next few weeks. We definitely have, across almost every forecast region, a pretty serious crust from the last few big storm atmospheric rivers. I could say at this point, we've seen in some areas weak snow forming above it, the kind that could form persistent slab avalanche problems in the coming weeks, but it hasn't been widespread. And there's at this point, uncertainty about whether or not it's going to develop into a serious problem.
It sounds like we should really be tracking the forecast going forward to find out what's happening, eh?
Yeah.
Great. The next question comes from Brad, and Brad's just asking, he's talking about La Nina, and I think I think a lot of forecasts or long-term forecasts have talked about this being a La Nina winter, which often means colder and I guess more snow, colder temperatures. But he's asking, do La Nina winters correlate with, I guess, avalanche problems of certain types or more avalanche problems of certain types?
That's an interesting one that's like been looked into a little bit, and it's a tough one to kind of see clear patterns and results. Definitely with the colder temperatures, we do see more snow type events than rain. And so we do see more storm slab problems over the course, number of storm slab problems. And in a really kind of warmer El Nino winter, there has been evidence that there's more wet avalanche problems, but it's really only been resolution in the wet versus dry type of avalanches. The actual character and types of avalanche problems is tougher to see. And ultimately, it really depends on the short-term progression of weather on the scales of days or weeks, rather than seasonal averages.
Okay, great. Thanks, Simon. Next question comes from D. Sue, who's just asking about, the most common grave mistake you've seen groups commit in the backcountry. Is there one you see more often?
Oh gosh,
It's a tough one.
grave mistake.
If you're not sure, we can move on to the next question.
Yeah,
Come back to it
I'll
later.
think about that one. Yeah.
All right. From Isabel, she's just asking, how many days of prior to going out should you be tracking the forecast?
That's a good question. I guess the most important thing would be to check the most current forecast because of how uncertain and quickly the weather changes. That's kind of the at minimum. Check the latest forecast the night before, and ideally maybe in the morning of heading out. Sometimes there are updates based on overnight weather. Not always, but sometimes. It doesn't hurt to stay in touch with the forecast, maybe not every day leading up to a trip, but being somewhat in tune with what's going on in your region for the entire course of the winter doesn't hurt. So I think rather than reading it on consecutive days before a trip, just checking it weekly, at least in your region, to get a general sense of what kind of problems could be developing.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, from Rick Bruce, he's just asking about one thing. Is that something, if you hear of one, that's something you want to be considering on all slope angles, or is it more dangerous in worse in certain spots?
Yeah, so wumping is simply a sign that there's some kind of buried weak layer in the snow. And it's happening because when you get a wump, you're causing the failure, but the terrain isn't steep enough to cause an avalanche. So what that means is if you're finding the snowpack structure that is capable of wumping, there'd be potential for an avalanche in steeper terrain, and it could really be any steeper terrain. It'd be hard to kind of know which types of terrain features without knowing more about the nature of that weak layer.
Okay, thanks. From Sean, this isn't directly related to the avalanche problem, or it's not related to the avalanche problems, but it is, I think something that's of issue with more and more people in the backcountry. He just wants to know, how do you manage traveling below or above another party?
Yeah, that can be a challenge one, especially as we see areas get more busy. Yeah, well, if you're below, definitely depending on the conditions, you want to reconsider whether or not you want to be below them and like keeping a wide berth until they're out of start zones potentially. It's a challenging one though.
Yeah, for sure. Give them as much space as possible, or try to find a different route if you can.
Mm-hmm.
From Jonathan, he's asking how long it usually takes for a storm slab to mellow out.
Oh yeah, I think there are some rules of thumbs that are in the Avi videos, and I think off the top of my head, I think what we say is that typically one or 2 days in the coastal areas and a day or two longer as you move further inland, but it's typically just a matter of a few days.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I think that's all we've got. We had another question from Jeremy that's yeah, that was just answered, so I think we're good there. If you want to take another crack at the most common error you see groups make in the backcountry, we can go with that, or we can we can just go to another question that came in from Tyler.
I wish I had an answer to that one, but I'm
yeah.
Thankfully, I'm seeing a lot of good behavior.
Great. Well, yeah, sorry about that, Disu. Maybe we'll keep that question live in case we see him.
Yep. But I think, with Disu, him or her, I think they're discussing when you're out away from everything, away from all the forecasts and information. And it's like, what are you trying to keep as a most important factor to keep in your mind all the time? And I think personally, and some experiences I've had, is really paying attention to the weather and calming your stoke a bit, because I find you get out there and it could be snowing that 30 centimeters in 24 hours, and you're just excited about your big trip, and you're out at a hut and you're having a great time. And there's a movie, A Dozen More Turns. That's a prime example of just pushing it a little bit more because you're having a good time and enjoying that stoke and getting at it, and just keeping your senses, sticking to your plans and not going outside of your comfort zones and stuff like that. It's the human factors, I think, that would be, the grave errors, because we are the people that trigger the avalanches. It's not a freak of nature that happens out there. That's my 2 cents anyways. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was just trying to come up with a bit of an answer there, because it's a tough one, because there's a lot of circumstance that happens out there. So I just thought I'd interject. Maybe that helped out with get a little bit of beta there.
No, I agree. The only time I've taken my transceiver out in 10 years of ski touring was when, me and a friend didn't communicate well. And, it was a tough day, it was spicy conditions out there. We were in the trees, we didn't communicate well. And I triggered a small slide and then he triggered another one and I didn't know where he was and everything worked out well, but definitely it was a lot, like it was a communication issue. So, we were just a bit too excited by the great skiing and didn't talk well enough about how to approach the terrain we were going into. Anyways, one more question from Tyler. Maybe we'll make this the last question of the night. So Tyler's asking of the 4 emphasized slab avalanche types, so I guess the 4 that you talked about first, which is the most difficult to gather reliable data on in the field or in snowpack tests? Is it deep persistent slabs due to their depth or something else?
Yeah, I think both either persistent or deep persistent can both be difficult. And ultimately because they're involving these deeply buried weak layers and you can dig down to look at them, but you're really limited because you're only looking in one spot and what you're looking at right there could be different a couple of feet to your left or right. So it's really hard, even if we get observations about buried weaknesses, it's really tough to take that and make a decision based off just a few observations.
All right, thanks so much, Simon. I think that's all we've got for questions. So pass it over to Brent to finish things up here.
Great, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Simon. Great presentation. I think people really enjoyed the quizzes and getting their brain thinking about terrain and the avalanche problems. Those exercises are always super enjoyable, especially that terrain evaluation. How are you traveling and what are you looking for out there? So we got a couple draw prizes tonight, folks. Lots of you are hanging out. We got quite a few people out there. We got a couple donated from the North Face. We're gonna pick a couple folks off the list. That's gonna be Alex's job. First one, we got a Salty Dog beanie from North Face. And the winner is Alex. And,
the winner is, and I have a name drawn. I just need to make sure they're still here, and they are indeed. The winner is Kat Kraus. So Kat, congratulations. You've won a nice North Face Salty Dog beanie. To claim your prize, please email producer@avalanche.ca. So, and then congratulations.
Awesome. Congratulations to you. And producer@avalanche.ca. And our second draw prize is a pair of Steep Patrol Future Light gloves from North Face. So Alex will have a winner there, and it is
hold on a second, just drawing the name from the hat, the virtual hat. And the winner of these great gloves, which I will show up right here, is Rob Popkin. So congratulations, Rob.
Nice.
Yeah, hope you enjoy these. So once again, Rob, just send your email to producer@avalanche.ca to claim your prize. Congratulations.
That's great. Congratulations to all you folks that won those prizes. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out tonight. We really appreciate your interest in avalanche safety. Avalanche Canada, nonprofit organization. You can support essential programs like these webinars, forecasts, stuff along that lines by donating a little bit of money to Avalanche Canada. There's a link in the chat box to do donations. I'd really like to thank Simon again. That was a super awesome presentation. I hope people understand that, all this information is available at avalanche.ca. In the forecast, there's the regular, just your plain generic, what are the danger levels, but then there's also the avalanche problems. And then there's also the details in there if you want more as well. And if all this stuff does seem a bit Greek to you, get an AST1 course, get some education so you understand what you're up against out there. I know we had at least 50% at an AST1. That's super awesome to see. It seems to be a pretty popular stream of education nowadays. And there's tons of other stuff on there. We had a few questions about, what is the definition of a persistent slab? And, Simon gave us the Cole's notes on that, but you can go to AviSavvy for some of those terrain evaluation quizzes and exercises. And the glossary on our website is full of tons of information. If you don't understand a term, just look it up in the glossary. You know, dive into that stuff before you start reading or after you're reading the forecast to get a better understanding. Our next webinar next week, ready to rescue. You're not going to want to miss this one. We got Chris Rubens, one of our Avalanche ambassadors. We got one of our forecasters, Drew Nyland. They're going to talk about why it's good to have that companion rescue training and have it ready with you whenever you head out. Pre-registration is required, folks. We really thanks for coming out. Hope you enjoyed the evening, and we hope you have a fantastic winter. Take care.